Hi, I'm Ray Sun. I'm an associate professor of history at Washington State University. I'm so pleased to be with you today. I'll be co-presenting this talk with my colleague Shane Gower, and our topic is homecoming for the war dead. And the question which we have in mind is, can the dead ever truly come home? So we decided that we would divide this up into two presentations. I'm batting leadoff, so to speak, and I'll be talking about U.S. war dead who were buried overseas. Now, I chose Margraten as a case study because this is an exceptional case of a Dutch community that has really embraced the dead who are buried in the U.S. military cemetery there, and I'll be going into detail about that in the latter half of my presentation. This cover photo is a picture from the U.S. military cemetery at Margraten. It shows the typical rows of crosses and stars of David. This is a relative of one of the fallen, and he was actually connected to the cemetery at Margraten once he found out about the project. And so, I thought this would be a good opening to show that this project, the Faces of Margraten, actually helps bring survivors and family members of the fallen to visit their loved ones far overseas. So more on that in a moment. But first, the question, which really is the center of both Shane's and my presentations, which is, can the war dead ever truly come home? And so the question is first, what is a homecoming? All right, what do we mean when we talk about coming home? And I think that for many of us that we have some pretty clear ideas, and it's usually very positive, right? The idea of a homecoming is inherently one of a reunion, one of family coming together, of thankfulness for having survived the war, of bridging a separation and renewing life again. And this image here, many of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with it. This was a very, very popular image as a kid. I loved Norman Rockwell, and I grew up studying his works. This was a cover on the Saturday Evening Post in May 26th of 1945, simply called The Homecoming. Now, if you've been following Norman Rockwell's art throughout the war, you know he was following a particular soldier, and this is that soldier coming home. And, we could do quite a bit with this image here. We know that he's from probably an Irish, given the red hair, an Irish working class family. I'm guessing New York, but it could be any one of the big East Coast cities, maybe even Chicago. We see the entire family rushing out to the front porch. Mom is throwing her arms wide in a big embrace. The neighbors are peering over from the windows and from the trees, and the dog, even his dog, is racing to meet him, and I assume this is the girlfriend, the girl he left behind, kind of shyly hiding around the corner. So this is what homecoming meant, in its idealized form in 1945, and I think this is what homecoming still means when we give it a first thought. All right, and so all positive and all wonderful. But the question then is, how does the death of the serviceman or woman change the meaning of the concept of homecoming for the families of the war dead, right? What does it mean when they know that their loved one is dead, that he or she is not coming home, at least not coming home alive? And you could extend this question, what does it mean for their communities? What does it mean for their larger society? And, so the image between the contrast between these two images of the Norman Rockwell painting of the joyous reunion on the one hand and this photograph of the American military cemetery in Normandy overlooking Omaha Beach on the other is stark, to put it mildly. And, the cemetery in Normandy is beautiful in its own way, and great honor and respect is paid to it, but there's no getting around the fact that these servicemen would never come home. And so the question is, what did this mean to their families, and can the dead ever truly come home? All right, or are they forever somehow separated? I thought I would offer a few suggestions for what it means for the war dead to come home as a means to get your thinking started. These are just my own thoughts. They're certainly not comprehensive. They're not definitive. They may not even be right, but at least we can use this as a basis for discussion. And so I think there's three major points which we can use in thinking about a meaningful homecoming for the war dead, even though they're not going to be able to come home alive, right? And the first would be to be remembered, right? To come home would be to be remembered, to be cherished in the minds and the hearts of their families and their loved ones. And this is so important, just to have a name remembered. You may remember from recent years when there's been massive protests over deaths due to police violence, and the slogan for the crowd, just for example, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations is, say their names, and they will chant this at the protests, or you see it written on the murals. And there is a power in the name being remembered. It matters. There's a power which I don't fully understand, all the depths to which we could unravel this, but there is undoubtedly an immense power in names. Names are a centerpiece of memorials. Reading names are a centerpiece of commemorations. So to be remembered would be foundational, I think, for making the war dead come home. Secondly, to honor them, to give meaning to their deaths and meaning to their lives as well. The worst that could happen, I think, would be to say, well, they died, but we don't know why, or they had a meaningless death. That is annihilating the purpose of their death. And so why did they die? So to be able to find, to give a meaningful answer to this question of meaning, why they died, is there a purpose? This is very important, that their deaths have significance. And finally, that the dead remain connected to the present and to the future, right? To the present generation, to generations to come, that they're not simply names without meaning. Who is this guy? Have no connection with them. That they remain connected in history and memory, in meaning, that they're woven into the lives of the present. And so the question is really, how can this happen in overseas cemeteries, right? When they're separated by thousands of miles, it's difficult to get there to visit at all, let alone frequently. They're among quote-unquote strangers. How can the dead be remembered, honored, and connected when they're so far away, literally? This image here is also from Margraten. This is a corporal, Harry Hudak of Cleveland, who in 2004 made this visit to the cemetery, and he's visiting the grave of his lieutenant, whom he served under. And clearly there's a deep and loving bond between the two. He is kissing the gravestone of his lieutenant. And so I think that this picture encapsulates, the 3 points I was trying to make about coming home. He's certainly, Corporal Hudak is certainly remembering Lieutenant Duffy. He's honoring him, and he is still very much connected with him. Here's an overview of background on overseas burials, World War II burials. So we have about 400,000 plus U.S. war dead, about 290,000 combat deaths. There'd be 280,000 plus sets of remains to be interred. Over 170,000 families requested that their loved ones' bodies be returned to the United States, right? That they be repatriated to the United States. That left about 93,000 war dead who were buried overseas, both in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific theater. And they would be typically buried in military cemeteries run by the American Battlefields and Monuments Commission, ABMC. And also these cemeteries will memorialize close to 80,000 missing in action, right? Those who were lost and whose remains are never found. So this takes us to our case study, Home Away from Home, the American the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten. So Margraten, as you can see on the slide in the lower left there, is in the southeasternmost part of the Netherlands. It was liberated in mid-September 1944 by the 30th Infantry Division and became the designated site to receive American dead from the very hard fighting going on all around it. And if you look at the map, you can find the Hurtgen Forest. To the east, you can find the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge just to the west and the south of it, and then, of course, Operation Market Garden going up in the Netherlands that fall. The military cemetery was established there in November of 1944. There were hundreds of bodies being brought there a day at the high point of its activity, and ultimately there were about 18,000 dead buried there. Now, many of these bodies were eventually returned to the United States, but when the ABMC cemetery was established, there was just over 10,000 U.S. war dead who were honored, and it's broken down by 8,300 remains there, burials, and then 1,722 missing in actions are memorialized on the walls. These images here show you the cemetery. A figure there, a woman with doves and a tree growing out of a stump showing new life. On either side of the memorial pool are walls engraved with the names of the missing. The inscription on the back reads, "Each for his own memorial, earn praise that will never die, and with it the grandest of all sepulchres, not that in which his mortal bones are laid, but a home in the minds of men." And so that is directly addressing those whose remains were never found, but in a larger sense, of course, it encompasses all of the war dead. Are they still remembered? Are they still honored? Are they still connected to the present? So in Margraten, each grave, and this is a remarkable rate, each grave has been adopted by a local family. And this has been going on ever since 1945. And typically the graves are care for the graves are passed down through the generations. And there are now 300 people or families on the waiting list to adopt a grave at Margraten. So this is really an extraordinary level of local participation in caring for the American war dead. And they're honoring them, of course, because they recognize and remember the American Army's role, the American servicemen's role in liberating the Netherlands, and they're showing their gratitude by making sure that these dead are remembered. Now, the heart of the Margraten cemetery, and what really makes this case stand out among military cemeteries in Europe and in Asia, is the Faces of Margraten project. And very simply, the Faces of Margraten was founded relatively recently in 2014 by a young Dutchman named Sebastian Funk. I think he's barely 30 years old. And Funk had adopted a grave himself at age 13, so you can see where his heart is, all right? And he's passionate about remembering the dead. And he began by starting a foundation, the Fields of Honor Foundation, and they established a database for the war dead in Margraten who were buried there. And then in 2015, Funk said it would be a great idea for the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II if we could find as many photos as we could to put next to the graves. And so they began with 2,000 photos on hand, so to speak. And they found 3,300 by May 2015, which was the 70th anniversary. They have received their 8,000th photo this just past February of 2021. And this means intensive work through genealogical records, libraries, and many, many appeals and to the public. And as word of this has come out, more and more American outlets, newspapers are publicizing this and saying these are the names of the dead at Margraten whose photos are missing from our state or from our community. I've given you a few links that give you examples of those appeals. And these images show at the top Dutch volunteers who placed the photos there. So the photos are not there year-round. They're just there for typically a 4 or 5 day period in May every other year. Okay, so the top photo shows the Dutch volunteers placing the photos, and the bottom photo shows a volunteer researcher. Her name is Becky Melhus in Fargo, North Dakota, who is trying to track down relatives and photos for some of the missing photos from for the North Dakota war dead. It shows the cooperation that has now arisen between the Dutch and the Americans. And so you may want to think about, and if you decide to use this project in your classes, ask your students, what difference does a photo make? Because for Margraten, the photos have really turned this into a centerpiece of remembrance of the war and of honoring the American war dead. So what do photos do? What do we see when we see a photo, and what difference does it make when we visit a cemetery? And here's a couple of ideas that I have. Once you see the photo, they become a person, right? They're not just a name on a piece of stone. You see their personality. You may see their potential. You see their humanity, right? It really, in a sense, brings them back to life. It makes them imaginable and personable. And this makes it so much more meaningful and easier to remember and to care, I would argue. So what we see here are banners on the road leading into the cemetery, and the banner reads, "The Faces of Margraten, 10,023 names, 10,023 faces." They don't have the 10,023 photos yet, but they're getting pretty close. Okay? And the last open event they held before the pandemic in 2018 drew about 20,000 visitors over 4 days. So you can see that this is really striking quite a response. And of course, it's both Dutch and American visitors as well as other internationals. At this point, I'm going to show a 3-minute video that will give you a much closer sense of what this project is about. It will give you a sense of the cemetery itself and of the process of putting the photos out and why the photos matter and the response that the photos generate. So enjoy the video, and then I'll be back with some concluding thoughts.
Faces tell us so much. They may give you an insight as to how old someone is, the stresses and the strains that they have felt. Someone with dreams, someone with hopes, an individual that expresses love and is loved by many. Faces tell us every person is special.
It is an honor to welcome you to today's memorial ceremony.
Here at the Netherlands American Cemetery, we commemorate the lives of 10,023 Americans who gave their all for the cause of peace, freedom, and to quicken the end of the deadliest war the world has ever seen.
Although we look back on events that took place decades ago, a few family members are still with us, and the pain of their loss is just as real today as it was 70 years ago. thank you from our family for what you have done today to remember Emmett's willingness to come to a place he didn't know, to fight in a war he didn't want to be in, and to do a job very few are willing to do. And what you've done today puts a human face to those long forgotten names.
So in conclusion, coming home in Margraten, what have we learned from this? I would argue that Margraten is probably the best case. It's an ideal case example of a local community, in this case a Dutch community, adopting the U.S. war dead as their very own. And there are numerous anecdotal accounts when you go online to research this of families that now consider the servicemen whose grave they've adopted as part of their own family, and they treasure this and they pass down the responsibility to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on. So this is really the best that one could hope for. And increasingly, American family members, descendants, are connecting with the Dutch host families, and in many, many cases, of course, now they all consider each other one extended family because of the common care for the servicemen that they're remembering and honoring. And so the question which I'll leave you with to think about, and you could discuss this with your students if you want to take up this topic, is have the Margraten war dead really come home? And in what way have they come home? And you can compare this with other cemeteries, other ABMC cemeteries, and you can certainly compare it with how the war dead are remembered in the United States. The momentum continues to build at Margraten. So this year, 2021, of course they could not have a large public gathering, but they read, 40 volunteers read all 10,000 names and showed the photos on a slideshow on Facebook Live. It took hours to go through, but it shows that this project is building momentum, it's growing, and I'm confident they will have close to 10,000 photos within a short amount of time. So thank you for your attention, and now and I'll be happy to answer questions or discuss at the end of our presentation. And now I will hand it over to Shane.
Thank you, Ray. Hello, my name is Shane Gower, and I teach social studies at Mirandacook Community High School in Reedfield, Maine. I'm also the president of the Maine Council for the Social Studies. Today I'm going to talk about the stories of the fallen from the Second World War and the role the American Battle Monuments Commission and the National Cemeteries play in remembering, honoring those who served and died in the Second World War. I did an activity with students where we compared the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri, to the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten, Netherlands. So, what did coming home look like for the fallen? In 1947, next of kin were notified of a choice. They could either leave their loved one in Europe to be buried in the newly established permanent American cemeteries, where they would be cared for in perpetuity by the U.S. government, or have them exhumed and brought back to the U.S. to be buried in the cemetery of their choice. The U.S. government would cover the costs involved. The American cemeteries overseas are considered American soil and are facilitated by the American Battle Monuments Commission, a branch of the U.S. government. In a sense, these fallen heroes returned home. Some of the fallen were physically returned to the U.S. and buried in national or private cemeteries. You just heard about one of the overseas cemeteries, the Netherlands American Cemetery from Raymond's son. Now I'm going to discuss one of the national cemeteries here in the U.S., where the fallen of the Second World War are buried. This is Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. So why Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery? In 2016, some of my students researched Second Lieutenant Sherman Andrews, who happened to grow up about 3 hours from our school in the town of Lubec here in Maine. Second Lieutenant Andrews was a bombardier for a B-24 Liberator in the 445th Heavy Bomber Group 701st Squadron, and he disappeared along with the rest of his crew after a bombing run when it appeared that they had collided with one of their own planes over Germany on December 11th, 1944. In 1947, Second Lieutenant Andrews' name was added to the Wall of the Missing at the Cambridge American Cemetery in the United Kingdom. Some years later, a memorial was constructed at Arlington National Cemetery with the names of the crew lost on December 11, 1944. In 1999, some hikers in northern Germany came across debris from a wreckage. The wreckage included human remains. Second Lieutenant Andrews' remains were identified through DNA testing within the wreckage. Brian Schaefer, Second Lieutenant Andrews' grandson, told us the family chose to have Second Lieutenant Andrews brought to the U.S. and buried near their homes in Missouri at the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. Second Lieutenant Andrews was buried with full honors on September 10, 2001. National cemeteries here in the U.S. were first established to inter and commemorate the Civil War dead. Today, 3 federal agencies manage 157 national cemeteries. The Army manages 2 national cemeteries, Arlington and the Soldiers' Home National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. The National Park Service manages 14 national cemeteries, and the Department of Veterans Affairs maintains the others and continues to establish new cemeteries to provide burial benefits to veterans who served. As I mentioned earlier, one of the more fascinating aspects of the fallen from the Second World War was the choice the government gave families to either have their loved one buried in Europe or returned home. There are many different reasons families had for which decision they made. Everything from wanting to be close to their loved one to maybe wanting to make sure that they were looked after by the government forever. One of the fallen hero stories that my students researched was that of Harvey Medor of Augusta, Maine, who was killed by shrapnel in Germany in 1945. His son Bob told us that his mother had decided to leave Harvey buried in Europe at the Epinal American Cemetery in France because his grandmother had put it in his mother's head that the government had no way to determine and identify the remains of those soldiers, and therefore the grandmother told his mother, you really don't know if that's actually Harvey that would be in the casket or not. So as a result of this, Bob told us that his mother made the decision to leave Harvey where he was. Bob also told us that he never saw any evidence of this really being an issue, that this was something that was widespread or anything like that. And he thought maybe it was just a paranoid response from his grandmother. He'd always wished that his father had been brought back and buried here in the United States. So it's just one example, but it gives you a sense for the wide variety of decisions that families made and reasons they had for making those decisions. Some families did not have a choice of a final resting place. Congress granted the Secretary of War discretionary powers to determine the final disposition of the some 10,000 unidentified remains from the war and for group burials with one or more known individuals. The War Department's final plan for the disposition of remains, written in September 1945, called for the return of all unknowns to the U.S. national cemeteries. Legislation in August 1947 reversed this practice and allowed for the internment of unknowns in permanent overseas cemeteries, where most of the 10,000 now lie. Most unknowns from the Pacific were split between the ABMC Cemetery in Manila, with just more than 3,600, and the Army's NMCP, with just more than 2,000. The War Department determined that individually unidentified commingled remains would be repatriated and interred in the National Cemetery most centrally located from the residences of the families involved. Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery contains more than 500 group burials. The largest is a group of 123 victims of the December 14, 1944 Japanese attack on Palawan Island. Solemn ceremonies mark the beginning and end of many repatriation voyages. The first group of American remains that left Antwerp, Belgium, were bade farewell from the whole town and paraded to the transport ship. Overseas transportation for the duration of the repatriation period was provided by the Army Mortuary Fleet under the jurisdiction of the Army Transportation Corps. The fleet was composed primarily of converted Liberty ships that could each carry around 6,500 caskets. The first mortuary ships arriving in San Francisco and New York received heroes' welcomes, followed by memorial events at local civic centers. In New York, the casket of an unnamed Medal of Honor recipient on board was conveyed to Central Park, and more than 250,000 spectators silently lined the route. The routine after each docking was to unload the ships, inspect and inventory caskets, provide the final lists to higher command, and notify families so funeral planning could be finalized. Remains were organized based on final destination and shipped by special railway cars to one of 15 distribution centers. Families received second notice when the remains reached their distribution center. The casket then began its final leg of the journey. Each was escorted by a uniformed representative of the service. So Jefferson Barracks itself was established in 1826 and soon became the primary permanent military installation west of the Mississippi River. The National Cemetery was established there in 1866. Though established for Civil War dead, there was a cemetery there previously, and so the remains of those who served in the Revolutionary War all the way up to the present are interred there. Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery is the final resting place for 8 recipients of the Medal of Honor. The cemetery features several memorials provided by various states to commemorate Civil War dead that are buried there. There are also memorials for World War II, conflict in Korea, and the war in Vietnam. Pictured here is the World War II memorial specifically for the Battle of the Bulge. A notable burial at the cemetery is U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Michael Blassie. Blassie died in 1972 when his plane was shot down over Vietnam. His remains were initially placed in the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery. Blassie's family had DNA tests conducted to confirm his identity and requested his remains be transferred to where they are currently located here at the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. This is a monument to the crews of the 52 submarines lost during the Second World War located in the cemetery. And this shows the cemetery decorated with wreaths for the holiday season. How did I bring this into my classroom? Well, in 2016, I created a lesson plan for the American Battle Monuments Commission and National History Day, asking students to compare the National World War II Memorial to the Epinal American Cemetery located in France, in an effort to answer this question: how do we memorialize World War II service members who made the ultimate sacrifice? I then modified this lesson plan to compare the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten, Netherlands, to the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. And I also extended the question: how does this effort to bring these fallen heroes home? I start things off with a hook. And so in order to engage students and generate interest, I give them each primary sources related to Second Lieutenant Sherman Andrews, which we read over together. Then I use a modified QFT, question formulation technique, with them by asking them to write down any questions that come to mind. In small groups, they share their questions with each other. Each student narrows down to one question they think is the most important, but also the one that they most want to answer. They then share their questions with the whole class with maybe a gallery walk or a Padlet. This is one of the 2 primary sources I used with students. This first one is a U.S. Army memo that discusses the B-24 Liberator crew as missing in action, dated December 1945. And you can even see that Sherman Andrews' name has been underlined on this particular document. The second primary source document I use for this hook is an invoice. This invoice is from a mortuary in Hawaii, and it is to the U.S. government, and it mentions the transfer of the remains of Second Lieutenant Andrews, and it's dated October 2001. Some examples of student questions generated by doing this QFT. Why was he buried in 2001 if he died in 1944? How did they find his remains? How did the Army determine he was not alive? What happened to the others who were missing? Why were his remains not embalmed? Why was he flown from Hawaii to St. Louis? Were they on a mission when they collided? And of course, there are many others, just some examples here. All right, so next I model what I'm going to ask students to do independently on their own. I read a brief overview of the Netherlands American Cemetery, and then I project one photograph from the Netherlands American Cemetery. I then model the analysis of the photograph by using the observe, infer, and feel model. So I ask students, what do you observe in this photograph? What do you infer from this photograph? And what do you feel when viewing this photograph? This is the photograph I used on the right from the Netherlands American Cemetery. And on the left, that's from Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. These are some of the student responses that were generated as a result of the observe, infer, and feel activity. I see crosses which look like they might be graves. What about people who weren't Christian? I wonder what that big stone symbolizes. I see some tall and thin trees, not like we have here. I see gravestones similar to cemeteries around here. The grass looks cut. It looks peaceful. The grave markers are all lined up. I can't see any names or information on the graves. I then, after modeling the activity, I then divide students up into groups of 3 to 4 and distribute one memorial analysis handout to each student. I assign half the student groups to analyze the Netherlands American Cemetery photographs and half of the student groups to analyze the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery photographs. I ask each group to select one photograph, explain why they selected it, and describe how it gives a feel of the fallen coming home. I then pair who analyzed different memorials and distribute one comparison chart handout to each student. So within each group, there are a couple of students who analyzed the Jefferson Barracks Memorial Cemetery and a couple of students who analyzed the Netherlands American Cemetery. And then they have the comparison chart where they can compare and contrast between the two cemeteries. And then lastly, I distribute one copy of the handout, What is Missing from the Memorial? I ask students to decide what aspect of honoring sacrifice or coming home is missing or deserves more attention from the cemetery. And these are some student examples of things that they identified that were missing from the cemetery. Statues, live poppies, representations of women and minorities, educational information about campaigns and battles, interactive elements to help visitors understand the war, information about the people buried in the cemetery, etc. These are some of the organizations that have been crucial in helping to sponsor this work. I was very fortunate to be able to travel to Europe with the National History Day Understanding Sacrifice program. And also I was able to bring a student for the Albert H. Small Sacrifice for Freedom Teacher and Student Institute to Normandy. And our lesson plans are published on the ABMC Education website. I also want to highlight the work of D-Day 2044. This is a nonprofit organization supporting this work. Their goal is to get all schools in the United States to teach about D-Day, with the ultimate goal in the 100th anniversary in 2044 of having American students present in Normandy for the 100th anniversary commemoration in 2044. They do provide $300 classroom grants to teachers interested in doing this work. And there's an email address here if you want to email Charlie Birmingham and tell him Shane sent you. Some other great resources that I mentioned in the presentation, information from the National World War II Museum, ABMC Education, using QFT, question formulation technique, and some other resources here. Also information about the two cemeteries and about Sherman Andrews. More information we got doing some interviews and doing some research on Sherman Andrews, who was from Maine. And these are some really good books that are helpful in doing this work. I want to highlight the Margraten Boys, which is a book about the Netherlands American Cemetery, which you heard about in the presentation from Raymond's son. And also Masters of the Air, which Sherman Andrews was a bombardier. And this book is about the bombing campaigns in Europe. It's a fantastic book. And then lastly, I want to highlight Triumph of the Dead by Kate LeMay, which is about the ABMC cemeteries and their design, the artwork, and the history behind them and how they were established. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you find these resources helpful, and we would be happy to take any questions that you may have.